Hello everyone and welcome back to The Word at Work. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we begin episode 2 in our series Your Kingdom Come, looking at the reign of King David in 2 Samuel chapters 5 to 10. Today we jump in chapter 5 verses 1 to 17. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, just push pause, catch up on those 17 verses and then you can tune back in. Well, today in our passage, there are 4 things that we want to notice about David as he is acknowledged as king for the first time over all of Israel. The first one is this: David restores the foolish with a covenant of grace. That's how his reign as king begins. Have a look with me at chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You shall shepherd my people Israel, and you shall become your ruler.'" Now remember, if we'd been reading from the start of 2 Samuel, we would have already seen that David had already been received as king by the southern tribes of Judah. However, the northern tribes of Israel had until this point resisted David's kingship. However, here at the beginning of chapter 5, they finally come to their senses. They had heard the good news that David was king. I guess in our modern way of speaking, we could say that now all of Israel had heard the gospel. Just like people come and put their faith in Jesus when they hear the good news of his arrival, that's exactly what we're seeing here in 2 Samuel chapter 5. Look at what they say. They say, "We are now bone of your bones and flesh of your flesh." They come to King David and they say, "We belong to you. We are your body and you are now our head." Very similar imagery, isn't it, to how Christians speak in the New Testament about what it is to identify as God's people, the church. We are his body and Christ is the head. They go on to say that even when Saul ruled over us, we always knew that you were the one who went to fight and win all the battles for us. In other words, they're saying, David, you've always been our saviour. We haven't acknowledged it up until now. We've been stubborn and hard-hearted, but we come now ready to confess that you are our saviour. And then they finish off by saying and acknowledging that David is their shepherd and he in fact is their prince, their ruler, their king. You can see already how David previews the lordship of Jesus as our king, can't you? Now, it must be said, however, that even though these are wonderful words to hear on the lips of the tribes of the north, let's be honest, these guys are a little late to the party. We're already 5 chapters into 2 Samuel, and only now they're coming and bowing the knee to King David. I'd imagine that David would have been well within his rights to turn them away and say, "Guys, I'm sorry. The southern tribes have already come and acknowledged me as their king." Or maybe he could have received them but insisted on some kind of punishment or sanction for their stubbornness. But of course he doesn't do that, does he? If you have a look in verse 3, it says that David made a covenant with the people. He accepted them and he bound himself to them, just as they are now binding themselves to him. It's really a covenant of grace. These northern tribes didn't deserve it, but David embraces them anyway, and he covenants their relationship. And what a wonderful way it is for David to begin his rule as king, with a covenant of grace, receiving back foolish people who should have known better. Well, that's the first thing we notice. The second thing we notice is in verses 6 to 10. David defeats his enemies with a surprising victory. Now, the first order of business for David, the newly appointed and anointed king, is that he goes out and fights against his enemies, and in fact the enemies of all of God's people. It turns out, we read in the following verses, that the Jebusites had taken occupation of Jerusalem. This has been allowed to happen on Saul's watch, but now David goes to set the record straight. When he approaches Jerusalem, they mock him from the walls and tease him and say, there's no way into this city. We could be here defending it as blind and weak and lame, and we could still drive you away. The situation looked pretty grim for David. Jerusalem was a well-defended city, and yet he wins a surprising victory. We read that he finds the sewer pipes, or the well pipes that let water in and out of the city, and he sneaks his troops in through an unexpected way, an unconventional attack. And in doing so, he easily defeats the Jebusites and puts them back in their place. He reclaims the city of Jerusalem for God's king and for God's people. Now, in many ways, there are echoes of Jesus' surprising victory, aren't there? We know that Jesus arrives in humble circumstance, not at all the king you'd expect. And his victory culminates on the cross, which looks like his defeat, and yet, in fact, is the moment of his greatest victory. King David, King Jesus. We see the foreshadowing in this early chapter of 2 Samuel chapter 5. And after he wins this surprising and unexpected victory, we get verse 10. And he became more and more powerful, speaking about David, because the Lord Almighty was with him. God is confirming David's rightful rule as king. And it's really God who wins him the victory. And David seems to be going from strength to strength. Which brings us to the third thing that we can see from this passage. And that is that David is now sought out by the nations who seek to honour him. You've got that in verses 11 and 12. The king of Tyre, a neighbouring country, comes with gifts and blessings for the new King David. Brings cedar logs, carpenters, stonemasons, and they build a palace for David within the city of Jerusalem. Now, this is something worth taking note of, but it's worth saying that I'm sure the king of Tyre's motives were not entirely pure. I think he recognised that there was a new king in town, and that this king was a powerful king, a mighty king, one who was renowned for defeating his enemies in battle. I suspect the king of Tyre was playing a bit of politics here. Keep your enemies close, keep your friends close rather, and your enemies even closer. But that's not the concern of the narrator here in verses 11 and 12. The concern of the narrator is that as soon as David is received as king, he goes out and defeats the enemy of God's people, reestablishes the city of Jerusalem, and now we see the nations come and pay tribute to King David. You see, David's reign isn't just for Israel. This is a little foreshadowing that the king of God's kingdom is going to be a blessing to all the world. And we pick that up again in verse 12. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel. You see, it was when the nations came and honoured King David that he knew that God was with him and that this was part of God's plan for God's king. Verse 12 goes on to say that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. That is, God had exalted David's kingship and the kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. For the sake of his people Israel, because Israel were always meant to be a vehicle through which God would bless the world. And we get a little hint of that here with the arrival of the king of Tyre and the gifts that he showers upon David now that he's taken the throne. So David restores the foolish with a covenant of grace. David defeats his enemies with an unexpected victory. David is sought out by the nations who bring him honour. So far, so good. But I wonder if you notice the twist in the tale at the end of our passage today. David's greatness is tarnished by his weakness. And that's verses 13 and 14. If so far in chapter 5, we've been driving down the freeway at 120 kilometres an hour with the music pumping our favourite song and the air conditioning keeping us cool and comfortable, all of a sudden we see a red light flashing on the dashboard. It's a warning light. Something has gone terribly wrong, and our attention is drawn to it here in verses 13 and 14. I wonder, when you read it, did you feel uncomfortable as this passage drew to a close? I hope so, you should have. Verse 13 and 14 says that after he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. The narrator simply reports this. He doesn't make comment, but you see, he doesn't need to, does he? If we're switched on and reading thoughtfully, then we know something here is not at all right. And the first giveaway is in those opening words of verse 12. David took. You see, up until now, the kingship is nothing that David has grasped for himself. He's always been patient, waiting on the timing of the Lord, and the Lord has delivered the throne to David. The people come and ask him to be their king at the start of the chapter. But now David takes. And if we've been reading the story from the start of 1 Samuel, that is a warning light. Because in 1 Samuel chapter 8, God warns them if they want a king like the nations, then that king, as King Saul in fact did, will take from them. The fact that David is now taking is a bad sign. It's also a bad sign that he's taking many, many wives and concubines. Because back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, we're told that God's king is not to take many wives, because they will turn his heart away from the Lord. Now, this is a dark foreshadowing of a time not long from now when David will indeed pursue other women, most noticeably with his affair with Bathsheba. But it even goes beyond that, because we know David's son Solomon, when he comes to the throne after David's death, he was the wisest of all kings. Israel flourished under his rule until his heart was turned away by many wives. And in fact, Solomon is mentioned there in verse 14 without comment, but as one of the children that was born to David by his multiple marriages. There is a dark foreshadowing here that despite all of the wonderful things that David did and how God blessed him as his rule began, that David didn't completely execute the duties of king the way that God wanted him to. This is indeed a bitter end to what otherwise is a wonderful story. You see, Jerusalem was not just the place of David's greatness, but we're given a hint here as his rule begins that it's also going to be the scene of terrible weakness. In other words, we know right from the very start that as wonderful as David is, he's not going to be the final king that will usher in the fullness of God's kingdom, is he? The good news for you and me is that we know that when God's King Jesus arrives, he isn't susceptible to this kind of weakness, and he doesn't make these kind of mistakes. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, just like David entered Jerusalem, Jesus did it only a week before his death. He came in greatness, but he didn't come to take. Jesus came in all humility. He came ready to make a sacrifice of himself. He came in his greatness, but he didn't come to take. Rather, he came to give. He came to give his life as a ransom for many, and so be the one true king that we really, really need. He came to give his life for you and me. We're going to pick up the story in our next episode, and in order to do that, I want you to read ahead. I want you to read 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 17 to 25, the rest of chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5, 17 to 25. I look forward to seeing you in our next episode.